And we are here with the final of our 10.0.7 tier list, the Mythic Plus tier list. Now this is going to be aimed more towards the higher key end. Of course, at the lower key end, really anything 20 lower, even like a 22 and lower. Honestly, even a little higher than that. Everything's viable. Everything's an S tier. Play what you want. Play whatever you want to do. As you get higher, though, then this tier list will start to kind of help you pick a class you want to play. You shouldn't use this to kind of inform your decision on making a group. Player skill will always be a much more important factor when making choices like that than whatever class they're playing. I would much rather bring a better player on a worse class than a worse player on a better class, but that's just me. So with that out of the way, we'll get into it. Obviously, tiers higher up are a little bit stronger, tiers lower down a little bit weaker. It's hard to paint a picture of all of M plus in just one tier list because things can change depending on the dungeon. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Keep that in mind. So with that, we're going to head into the first one. I'm going to put Affliction Warlock in C. Now, Affliction Warlock is weird, and you're probably like, watch C tier, but it's in the MDI. And the MDI is very removed from actual gameplay. So in like something like Algothar, I do think Affliction Warlock is better, but all of their damage basically comes from mass AoE, things dying with their dots on it and kind of exploding, Seeds of Corruptioning, and just hitting a ton of stuff. That really only happens in Algothar Academy this season. Otherwise, Warlock's utility isn't anything crazy. Yes, they're very tanky, but single target damage in those scenarios isn't great, and their AoE in smaller packs isn't great either. They're ranged, which is nice, but overall, unless you're doing MDI style pulls, or specifically in Algothar Academy, where I think this is a B or an A tier, then AF is a C tier spec. Arcane Mage is next. I'm going to put it up in B tier. Arcane Mage has really, really strong burst, and then nothing. So that burst is very valuable. It's very strong in certain scenarios, bursting down a priority target or hitting a ton of barrages into like a group. It's very, very good. But overall, the burst is kind of, your mileage may vary. Some packs you don't really need it. It's not too valuable. Sometimes it can be very good. Outside of those cooldowns, though, all Arcane Mages are doing is just spamming Arcane Explosion. So it's a bit of a feast or famine thing. If you need that burst to burst down a prio mob or on like a boss, it's very good. But then the Arcane isn't have that much use of you for the next few for the next like minute or so. So it's kind of a bit of a risk reward. If you pull around it, it can't be good, but otherwise B tier. Arms Warrior is going to be in B tier as well. Arms Warrior's biggest downfall is that they have to choose between single target and AoE a bit more. There's a bit of a hybrid build, but I don't personally think that build is as good. I do think Arms is very solid though, but overall it being in B tier is a bit due to Fury being a bit better. Specifically in their talent tree, in the class tree, Arms loses out to a few other points that Fury doesn't. Bitter Immunity is one of the big ones. So that is a downside for Arms for sure. But Arms is pretty fun. I do enjoy the spec. I think it's very fun to play, and it can do very big burst windows when you layer all of the cooldowns on top of each other. But I do think it's a little bit worse than Fury, which does kind of knock it down to B tier. At the same time, Prot Warrior is very strong, which does cannibalize its utility a bit. Prot Paladin is the best tank right now, so that kind of, alleviates Arms Warrior a bit. But overall, I do think B tier is a safe pick for it. I'm going to put Assassination Rogue down in C. Assassination's main thing is boss damage, basically. You can have these really strong 45-second AoE silences with their bleeds, but the dot-based specs are never really that insane, especially for Assassination, when their niche isn't really multi-dotting, it's more like a single target dot. So I do think that Ass can be very good at not bursting down, but prioritizing one target or being really good for boss damage. But I think overall Assassination is kind of limited in what it can do for you in a lot of damage profiles in dungeons. Now, it is a rogue, it has great rogue utility, it has things like, it has all the stops, it has Shroud, has all that stuff, so that's very useful. It's very tanky, but I do think it's worse than the other two rogue options, and C tier is where I'm putting it. Next, we're going with Boomy. Boomy is going to be our first S tier for a few reasons. One, their damage is very, very good. Starfall is very strong. All their dots are very strong, and they can do very strong single target damage. The removal of having to Stellar Flare every single mob and every single pack has, alleviated the ramp up time a bit, which is very good. But on top of that, Boomy is just one of the most utility-focused classes in the game. All of their utility is very powerful. They have knockbacks, roars, incaps, off healing, stuns, hibernates if you need it, roots, dispels, B-res. It's all very strong. They bring a verse buff too. So that is very good, and honestly, part of the reason why it's an S tier, the damage is very strong as well, and they have a lot of damage pack to pack, while also having strong cooldown and incarnation. So I do think that S tier is very fair and viable for Boomy, and I'm going to put it up in there. Next is BM. So BM is a bit torn between A and B tier. The reason for this is that it's very flat damage profile, so it doesn't burst at all, but it has really strong priority target with kill command, and really strong just passive general cleave. It's probably the best at that. You could argue it's down in A or B. It brings lust, which is very useful. It also has all right defensiveness. Now, the dungeons this season are they hit you very hard as you scale up above like a 25 or something. So in those scenarios, while they might have a lot of defensives, they do have long cooldowns, which is a big detriment to it. So I think this one's really tight between A or B. I could really see it going either way. I'm personally going to put it up in A tier because of that prio niche, as well as how much damage they can do to bosses. But if you want to argue it's down in B tier, I do think that's also viable as well, and a fair argument. Moving on to Demonology. Demonology I will put in B for one reason, and that's just it's been nerfed too much. There are some nerfs that came down the pipeline to their AoE. There's also some buffs to another Warlock spec, which we'll get to literally next. And I think that Demonology, while it has strong burst, just isn't the best in AoE anymore. It's outcompeted for Warlock utility and damage by Destruction, which I'll get to. So for that reason, I think B tier. It's a solid spec. It's not the best at anything, but it does do a lot of damage. Summons a ton of dogs, throws out a bunch of imps. It's very fun to play, but I do think it belongs down in B tier. Destruction, on the other hand, I'm going to put up in A tier. Destruction, with just like the trickle buffs they've gotten the entire time, has caused them to have really strong AoE damage now, with all your like Infernos, your Rain of Fires or whatever. So I do think that's very good there. They're very tanky. They're one of the tankier Warlock specs now that they've gotten the stuff, Soul Link or whatever it's called there. Demonology and Destruction are both very tanky. Their damage is just very strong. They have Infernal, which is good damage. They have just Rain of Fire ramping up. That scales really well into larger pull counts too. So Destruction, very solid overall. Good damage, good defensiveness. Very good spec. Devastation Evoker is coming up next. I'm going to put it in B tier. Its damage, very, very good. I have an alt of Devastation. I love the spec. But their biggest weakness is their defensiveness, as well as their threat generation, which is a funny one to say for DPS. So, for those of you who haven't played the spec, Devastation's Mastery Giant Killer causes them to do more damage upfront to targets. So, a higher health enemy takes more damage from the Devastation Evoker. And what this means, and just with the way it is class design, is you throw out all your damage in the first few globals on a pack. You're doing the most then. And this causes you to rip threat from the tank a lot. So, you kind of have to wait a bit, which does reduce your damage, but it also means you won't die to threat. On top of that, their only real defensive, excuse me, their only real defensive is like the Dragon Scales. And while that is good, and they got some buffs in 10.0.7, I do think they're just overall one of the squishier ranged, as well. They have like Lust, which is good, but they're just squishy, which does leave them down in B tier. When you're in that full AoE damage as well, your single target does suffer, so you're not like doing both at the same time, which does leave you a bit behind. But overall, they're very solid. You're never going to be upset for having one as long as they're a smart player and not dying to aggro issues. So Elemental is going to be another B tier spec. Elemental's biggest downfall is that they're kind of solid at everything, but not amazing at anything. So they're a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none kind of scenario. The fun little saying I like. So really, because of this, they're kind of mid in a lot of situations. They have good single target, good AoE, good defensiveness, good survivability, good utility, but none of it's like amazing. It's not like an amazing AoE class or with amazing utility. If they get damage buffed, it'd be pretty good. They do have a lot of passive knockdowns with Earthquakes. They have a knockup, which is very solid. Very rare to see knockups. There's only a few in the game. Earthquake knockdowns are very good too. They have the shortest kick in the game, 11 seconds, Wind Shear. Very, very strong. Shout out to Wind Shear. But overall, I do think that they're held back by just their nature of their class being kind of good at everything, but also not amazing at anything, you know? So B tier, I think, is solid for them. Damage buffs could move them up, but B tier for now. Enhancement, on the other hand, could honestly be argued between A or S. I'm personally going to put it down in A tier because there are a few other melee I think that are better that slot into the S tier. But Enhancement is very good. They have the same utility. Elemental Shaman has with the knockdowns with Earthquake, but they have Stun Totem, they have a short kick, they have a knockup. On top of that, they bring really strong single target and priority cleave, as well as just generic cleave damage. An Enhancement Shaman can absolutely slam in keys. It does a ton of damage. On top of that, they have Lust. They're pretty survivable. They have Ancestral Guidance. And fun little tidbit, they're also one of these specs that's kind of required for this weird no healer keys that's been going around, where the Enhancement Shaman uses like Chain Heal instead of Chain Lightning to spend their Maelstrom weapon stacks, which is crazy that there's like no healer keys happening, and Enhancement Shaman is part of that. So you know what, Enhancement Shaman, good for you, S or A tier. Honestly, could argue for either one, but I'm going to put it in A. Very good spec though. Next up, Feral. Feral's going to slot in A as well. Feral has amazing AoE damage. You've probably seen them in the MDI. However, unlike Affliction Warlock, Feral actually does scale much better into those smaller pull counts. Affliction is really only good in those crazy big pulls, but Feral can do pretty good damage at any size pull count, which is really, really good. The downside with them is that they're actually a little squishy, which is a little surprising. You'd think like bear form and endurance and all that stuff would be really good, but there's just a lot of really hard hits, and their innate kind of survivability is a little lower. Their single target's like nothing to write home about with their AoE talents, so I think that's holding them back from the S tier, but they're very, very good, very, very solid, and it's actually really fun to see Feral being really good for A tier, because it's been a while since we've seen it. Fire Mage is next. Fire Mage is going to be an A as well. So Fire started off really poor, but a ton of buffs to it has made them a really strong burst spec with their not immolation, combustion, where they do a ton of damage. They don't push Flame Strike now, unless that was changed at the time I made this video, but that's kind of funny. So most of their damage, they prio damage one target, and they just kind of spread their ignite out, and they end up doing a ton of burst damage fairly often. Fire, in terms of survivability, is the best of the mage specs. It has a cheat death. Cheat deaths are always going to be really, really, really good. So a cheat death just innately is very strong utility. They also have all the other mage stuff: Ice Block, Knockback, Breath. They have like a slow, I guess, but that's more like a frost thing. They're just really strong overall, and that 1 minute burst profile, which is probably the best profile for Mythic Plus, is just super, super powerful. Next up, we're going to put Frost down into B tier as well. So Frost thing is, honestly, is not a lot of burst right now. They do good AoE damage with Frozen Orb and Blizzard and all that stuff, but their burst damage is just kind of lacking. And where BM's burst damage is also lacking, they had a really strong single target. Frost single target is just okay. I can see it, maybe in certain scenarios where you need the slow, or you're pulling more consistently and the burst from fire isn't as useful, that it could be pretty good, but for the most part, because of this, I'm going to keep it down in B tier. 2 ice blocks is never as good as an immunity as well. So for that reason, B tier is where they belong. Frost TK, I'm going to put in C tier. So Frost is a real uptime spec right now, especially with Breath of Sindragosa. Obliterate can be played, but I'm pretty sure it's not as good as Breath is. So I think that'll keep it down in C tier for now. Frost is very cool. I love Frost as a spec. But because you need that constant uptime to keep all that damage going, and so much of their damage is in Breath of Sindragosa, unless you can constantly keep pulling for Frost to stay inside Breath of Sindragosa, which isn't really viable or realistic in a lot of scenarios, then Frost damage will suffer. It can be good if you can pull around it in that scenario, but those scenarios are so rare and far between that I do think we have to keep it down in C tier for now. Fury Warrior is an A tier spec, really, really good at self-reliance and healing, which is really important in Mythic Plus. You have one healer, which means that you being self-reliant is going to be very, very good. They have really frequent, strong AoE bursts, which is also very, very powerful. They have the ability to passively cleave with Whirlwind and then cleaving their abilities, which again, very, very strong. And they can do this all while bringing really solid single target damage. Their climb of Prot Paladin and the reduction in Prot Warrior a little bit has boosted up their utility suite as well, because it's being cannibalized less by Prot Warrior. So overall, I do think Fury is very strong. I think they're very good too. They're very easy to pick up and play. They're very tanky, survivable, and have good damage. So A tier it is for them. Havoc is in a similar story, but they're going to be S tier. The reason for this is that their damage is just a little bit more. They have great damage pack to pack to pack. Their cooldown Metamorphosis is very strong, but you don't really need it to do good damage with Havoc, as a lot of your damage in AoE comes from just I-Beam, which is 40 seconds, comes from Essence Rake, which lines up with the I-Beam, comes from Immolation Aura, which is around a 25 to 28 second cooldown. It comes with consistent stuff like Glaives. So you have a really strong burst profile for each pack, you have a really strong sustain profile for each pack, and whenever you hit a boss, you're doing really good damage as well, and without sacrificing much of your cleave. That should be the other way. You do a lot of cleave damage without sacrificing single target, but whatever, you get the idea. So they bring a great, amazing damage profile, and on top of that, they bring magic debuff, which is probably the best DPS debuff in the game, and then they also are just incredibly tanky. Now, there's a caveat to this. If there's physical damage or like extreme one-shots, then there's not a lot they can do about it. But they're very self-sustaining with Leech. They bring Blur, which is strong, and then they also have innate magic damage reduction, which is very, very good. So overall, Havoc is an S tier spec right now. They're very strong and will continue to remain that way for the foreseeable future. Marksmanship will be in B. Now, Marksmanship has much better burst AoE than BM does, or just, some of the other Hunter specs in BM. But they bring less single target, and they're also less survivable. They're less tanky, where BM has those pet benefits, MM doesn't, which does end up reducing their overall survivability. They're very strong, though, in their burst AoE, perhaps some of the best in the game, but because of their single target weakness, which is very important for keys, as well as their kind of just squishiness overall, I do think a B tier is a solid placement for them. Outlaw, I'm going to put an A. Outlaw has really strong pack damage with just kind of consistent blade, flurry, cleave. They're very tanky and very survivable. However, I'm going to put them in A because I think they're really, really good, but I don't think they're better than the other rogue spec sub, which obviously, bearing the lead a bit, but there you go. So I do think that they come down in A. They have a bit of a consistent profile again, which isn't the most wanted in Mythic Plus, but because of how effortlessly they cleave to 4 or 8 targets, that they're really actually pretty good there. But I do think that there are better specs for that. Here we go. Rat Paladin. So Rat Paladin has received a ton of changes in 10.0.7, and I think it is probably one of the best specs in Mythic Plus right now, me personally. So Paladin now has a 1 minute damage profile, and doing that 1 minute, it does insane burst damage. Outside of that, they also do good damage too. So a 1 minute damage profile is perhaps the best damage profile to have in Mythic Plus, because you have it for basically every pull that matters. On top of that, they also bring really respectable boss damage while doing their AoE rotation with their build and stuff like that. Now, of course, there is a little bit of a concession for single target to pick up all those AoE damage options, but it's not that serious. It's not that big of a drop to really matter. Ret is really defensively oriented. They have like 3 buttons now to push. They have a ton of off healing in their spec as well. They're very mobile with their horse changes, with their Blessing of Freedom changes. They bring great utility, stuns, blinds, a slow, I'm pretty sure. They bring a B-res, all that's really good. Cleanse, they bring a possibility to have either 3% armor or 5% healing and damage in certain scenarios. So Ret really is just crazy strong. I would recommend trying one out if you haven't. They're really fun as well. Really, really good spec, really great option. I'm so happy to see Ret being good. It's been bad for a long time. So shout out to Ret players. This really is your patch, and I hope it stays this way for the foreseeable future. Shadow is also going to join these specs up in S tier. Shadow Priest is probably the highest damage ranged right now. They bring a ton of damage on demand every 20-30 seconds with Shadow Crash, with their Mind Seer, tons of uncapped damage. They bring respectable single target damage in that build as well. They bring good Priest utility, Mass Dispel, Mind Soothe, stuff like that. Grip can be useful in certain scenarios. Stam buff, PI. So really, they just bring a ton of damage, have a ton of utility, and are just really, really strong in this current meta. Sub Rogue is also going to find its way up into S tier. Sub, in my opinion, is the best of the Rogue specs for this current tier, for M+. It brings really strong frequent burst, which again is really, really powerful in Mythic Plus. And on top of that, it brings all the really good rogue things you know and love. It brings Feint, Cheat Death for survivability, Cloak. It brings the stuns, the blinds, the kidneys, the saps. It brings skips. It brings utility poisons like a slow or a cast speed / attack speed reduction or a damage reduction. So all in all, Sub really has a complete toolkit. It's very, very powerful. It can even do priority damage really well in packs too. So there's not really a lot of scenarios where you'll find a Sub being bad. And for that reason, I think S tier is very, very fair. We are rounding the home stretch here in our tier list, and we're going to get to Survival Hunter, and honestly, this is the only tier spec. Survival Hunter, really fun, personal fan favorite spec of mine. It was actually the first one I ever played in this game, but its bombs are just so undertuned right now, it doesn't really have much of a hope of competing in AoE, which is really, really important in Mythic Plus. Now, single target will be very valuable for timing keys, but you do need to be able to do meaningful AoE damage, and with how weak the bombs are right now, I don't think that's going to happen. Survival does great single target, but their bombs are just so weak that they can't really compete with anything else. On top of that, they have the Hunter squishiness problem. Yeah, they bring Lust, but overall, I don't think it's going to turn out that well for Survival right now. And I do hope changes come in the next tier. We'll see. Of course, their tier set, we'll see how it is. It has a Wildfire Bomb interaction. We'll see how it turns out, but hopefully something changes about this one. Unholy DK, I'm going to put up in B tier. Unholy has the same thing as Affliction, where it's basically just mass AoE. In large pulls, Unholy does incredibly well. It scales very, very strongly into those pulls. However, the difference between it and Affliction is that it does do well in lower pull counts, like a smaller pull count than Affliction does. So it does better in more scenarios other than just mass pulling the Alcazar Academy. Its cooldowns are strong with Army, but they're also, at the same time, if you don't have Army, they're a little bit mediocre. Its cooldowns are really just for single target. They're very tanky though, really good utility with grips and stuff in dungeons. So I think that does give them a bit of an edge over Affliction Warlock. However, the rest of their damage profile is something to write home about outside of those big pulls. So I do think a B tier ranking is kind of the best for them. Finally, Windwalker, put it up in A tier. Windwalker has great AoE, that's it. It does really good AoE. Touch of Death spam can absolutely end a pack very quickly once they're lower. They do really good just spin to winning. And on top of that, single target buffs recently help out too. The biggest difference from like Shadowlands to now is just how many defensives they've gotten. They're very, very tanky. They bring 3 really strong raid buffs. Group buffs. I guess we're not in raid. They also bring like Paralyzing Touch, Ring, Leg Sweep. So just tons of stops in general. So I do think they're very good. They don't bring a crazy amount of AoE damage like the S tier specs do. They don't bring a crazy amount of single target to kind of add up to S. But I do think they're very strong, very good spec overall, and are very deserved of being in your key groups. So that are going to be my rankings for Mythic Plus in 10.0.7. 10.1 is right around the corner, so do expect me to come back and do this again in about a month or so. But overall, I do think this is what the rankings are going to be for 10.0.7. So let me know down below if you'd agree with me, if you disagree with me, if I'm wrong on one spec, if I'm right on one spec, and just in general what your thoughts are. Also, make sure you hit a like, and if you enjoyed it, drop a sub as well. I'll have tons of WoW content coming throughout the weeks as we lead into 10.1 and beyond. So with that, I want to thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.